You're listening to No Sex Please, I'm Religious, the podcast that explores religion's obsession with our bedrooms and what we do in them, benefiting queer refugees in Africa and hopefully other places too. Please support our podcast by subscribing and by supporting through Patreon, donations direct to our account, or even buying our merchandise, wearing our t-shirts, wearing our hats, telling the world, no sex please, I'm religious.
Once again, we're talking no sex please, I'm religious. And our guest today, I guess I'm not religious anymore. I'm introducing Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. And did I pronounce your names correctly?
You did. I could put a Scottish accent on when you pronounce mine,
Brian,
and you'd be incorrect though because I'm Irish apparently. But
right, so it's Brian McDowell then.
Oh, well done. You sound like you're from County Cork.
Troy, what accent should I have?
Oh, mine's a mix of everything, but my father's side is actually Anglo-Indian, British colonials, but with Scottish and Irish is the European side.
If I have to do a combination of Indian, Scottish and Irish, I need time to practice.
Yeah, fair enough.
I want the full Irish accent for my introduction, please.
Full Irish for you. Okay. Gentlemen, I have with me Cath Connolly, Dr. Cath Connolly. Could you introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Not with an Irish accent, I can't, but thank you. That was pretty impressive. I'm Cath Connolly and a long-term friend of David, and it's always good to be part of this podcast, No Sex Please, We're Religious. We explore all things to do with religion, both unhealthy and healthy religion, and a spirituality that can lead us into a greater understanding of our sexuality being a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. And Cath is also president of Humanity in Need, Rainbow Refugees. And you guys are aware that we're hoping one day to raise some money through this to help some of these queer refugees. Some wonderful, beautiful people in Africa and perhaps in other parts of the world as well, if we can grow that big, who are totally victimized by hateful messages from Christian leaders and have blood on their hands, the deaths and horrible assaults that have happened, all because of their hateful messages. But anyway, let's come back. I'm David Aliff, and we have with us Troy and Brian. Now, you guys are really past masters of podcasts now, and I'm still learning. Your podcast, I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, has thousands of followers, and you've done some fantastic interviews. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about the podcast, how that came about, and so on?
Yeah, you'll probably see Troy and I point at each other as a prompt for the other one to speak, so we don't talk over each other. But
does the pointing also include things like if you say something wrong, it's something like that?
No, we never pull each other up. It's a freedom of speech and voice is that we're never going to pull each other up.
And also the fact that we are former Christians, so we just silently judge each other.
I love that.
That is correct.
Okay.
Look, I guess the podcast, so we're actually close to releasing season 4, and it's been quite a journey over the first year was 2021, and we actually went a little bit manic in 2021 and did 2 seasons, 42 episodes, and it was quite crazy. I know some people podcast every week, but we also hold down full-time jobs, families, all that sort of thing. So how it came about was, Troy can speak more specifically to it, but it was actually through Troy walking and meditating. And it was during that time that he thought, we often used to catch up and talk about our experiences and try and work out what happened, essentially. Yeah. And Troy rang me one day and said, do you want to do a podcast? And I went, yeah, sure. Let's do a podcast. And we thought, we'll do a few episodes. We'll tell our stories. We'll see if people connect. And one thing that Troy did point out is he's been an avid podcast listener for a lot longer than I. He said that there's not an Australian experience for people to contextualize their leaving fundamentalism or being part of it and trying to work out what it is. So we thought we'll bring an Australian voice to the table, and here we are, 70-odd episodes in, and it keeps growing. The popularity certainly not fading, and we've created quite a community on Facebook. We've also got a community it's coming up to 1,000 people who really it connects as a bit of a therapeutic space. We try and point people in the direction of finding help that they can get to be able to navigate. there's no criteria for the group in terms of who can be there. There is in the way of expectations for behaviour, and we certainly don't see it as an evangelical platform for Christianity or atheism or any. It's about tolerance. It's about people being able to openly talk, help each other, and basically help navigate how messed up they are, because generally that's why people find us, that they're just messed up. They feel they're alone and trying to navigate this, whatever it is, alone. So when they find each other, it's created quite a community, and certainly we've got a big reach in the States, the UK, through Europe, but Australia remains our biggest audience. Probably 60-ish% of all of our listeners are from Australia. So it's certainly surpassed any expectations we had. Troy, did you want to add to that at all?
No, not at all. I thought that was very well done. Good job.
Thank you, Troy.
That's great.
There's certainly so much damage done to people when they're through the fundamentalist Christian churches. So much. Yeah, a lot of the work I do as a spiritual director is working one-on-one with people, sitting down and helping them unpack their stories, their great hurt that they've experienced in fundamentalist Christian churches. So, yeah, thank you so much for the work you're doing. As I say, I know on a very intimate basis some of these stories, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Cath, something that's interesting and that's blown us away is progressive, what used to be called liberal Christians back in our day, and that was a pejorative term, oh, he's a liberal. Now they've taken that and made it progressive is the word, but progressive Christians love us, which was really surprising for us, because whilst we were very cautious not to expect people to make 9 steps over to an atheistic position or agnostic position. So we're always cautious with that, but we didn't expect that the sort of liberal Christians were going to come along and support us in the way that they do. So it's really nice that I think we have a common enemy in the sense of fundamentalism, regardless of where we've landed. And that's one of the things that's really important about our podcast, which I don't think we were conscious of it at first, but we certainly are now, that it's not about where you land. It's about a trajectory out of fundamentalism. And that's the common denominator for us. So we have people extremely involved, even to the point of volunteering with our website and Facebook group, etc., who are progressive Christians and still have a faith.
Yeah, and that's certainly where I put myself as a progressive Christian. Certainly the same thing as both what you're doing and what I do. We come out of this place of realizing the great hurt that people are experiencing within fundamentalism. And in my case, saying that there is a different way we can have a really healthy spirituality within a Christian context that is not caught up with this whole atonement theology, which is so destructive, so utterly destructive, to say you're all damned. Sin and this horrible theology that comes from that. So I'm not at all surprised you're finding great support from people who are progressive Christians.
Yeah. When we first started this, and we've only done, I think this is our 6th episode, so we're all very new. When we first started it, the focus was the harm that thought had been caused was broader than even what we're talking now. And I see it even more so that way, just having done a few podcasts. So that it's a fundamentalism, yes, definitely, because that's the power base, if you like. But also with the interview that you guys did, for example, with Dave Andrew, and he, to me, he's always been, I've never spoken to him, I've always been friends on Facebook and looked at his stuff and so on. But he is, I use the term, even though I'm agnostic, he's very Christ-like. He lives the talk and he doesn't care who kicks him out for doing that sort of thing. But he talks about hierarchy. And so when you go back to the early parts of the church, then you'll see hierarchical dictates that caused so much harm to people who couldn't even read and write back then. And then it continued on from there. Certainly having Cath with us and a couple of other really good Christian folk, friends of mine on my panel, gives me a balance to this. But let me just mention that Dave Andrews again. So that podcast was really good. I know, Cath, you haven't had a chance to listen to that, but you will enjoy it. He was kicked out of so many groups, including YWAM. And one of our atheist members of Humanity in Need was also kicked out of YWAM years ago. And it was his case because he was gay, but he still suffers the hurt from that. But Dave's interview, I thought you guys did very well. And also he's obviously a passionate, right? But he's also very embracing of all the different other faiths and non-faiths as well.
Yeah, look, I think that was one thing that attracted me to reach out to Dave. So I used to be involved in TIER back in the day, and I think TIER was my outlet to be able to feel like I was doing something outside of the walls of the church. And I've always been interested in social justice. And so I think it was something that I felt a bit of a kinship with Dave. So reaching out to him was, parts of it were difficult conversations because he doesn't hide the fact that he is a Christian and he talks about Jesus and it's very much a progressive. So it's certainly a challenge to record the episode. But I think one thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't really narrow the scope of who we speak to and what we speak to about. We want to make sure that it's representative. And if we look at the span of our group is incredibly broad. And we had a lot of feedback around the Dave Andrews episode saying that people loved it. They really related, they connected, whether they were considering themselves progressive Christians or had left the church. But I think people felt that there was someone there who was challenging the system, was part of that. And I think that's really important. So regardless of where you sit, that it's someone who is challenging the system. So I have a deep admiration for Dave doing that and the position he comes from. And I think it's something that when I went back and listened, like when we were recording, I felt it was a great conversation, but going back and listening, I did feel that I felt slightly uncomfortable going, how many times can someone say Jesus? And coming from someone who does identify as agnostic as well, it was where? So it was a challenge, but then I just had to remind myself, there is someone challenging, and I love that.
He's part of a tradition of people. And Cath, on another occasion, we could get Cath to talk on this sort of stuff, because you're a co-director of the Living Well Centre of Spiritual Direction and training spiritual directors. So Cath's got an amazing knowledge of some of the renegades of the Christian church, not the saints like popes who just become saints because they were pope, but people who really challenged the system. And there were heaps of Dave Andrews, and I can't think of the female form of Dave, but anyway, the Joan of Arc and all those sort of people, but Hildegard and so on that you told me about, Cath. Yeah, I did. Sometimes I'm aware, it's so, like in that interview, you talked about you talked about Jesus a fair bit, didn't he? But for some people, that's actually triggering. Even the word Jesus is triggering. But I'm glad that people endorsed it and loved it so much, because I think his sincerity comes through with that.
It's funny, though, you talk about for some people it's triggering. I totally triggered. I triggered the whole interview. I triggered during the edit. Wow. I actually said to Brian, I can't listen to this one more time. Yep. You'll need to. And I say that to just be authentic, because as much as we are trying to be positive towards progressive Christians, at the same time, some of the language that they use and some of the conversations that can be had, I'm not interested. And I don't give a shit. And so when Dave was speaking, if you go back and listen, you'll hear I don't talk very much at all. It's a lot of it is Brian. And afterwards I said, I actually put it out after we edited it to a few people and said, should this even be on our podcast? Because it was so Jesus-centric. And I'm thinking, God, if I'm triggering, what about the audience? And even putting it out there, there was a little bit of a disclaimer in our Facebook group saying, be careful of this one. But as Brian said, it's good to hear that there are people inside the system that are challenging, and by that. And that's why ultimately I didn't veto the episode, because Brian and I, we have an equal share in that. He can veto, I can veto. And I could see that it was also part of Brian's journey, that he had been a part of this. So in telling our stories, this may not be where we've ended, but it was certainly a place we both passed through to a point. So in that, I thought it had value.
Yeah, that's good. And it's also good for us to acknowledge that for the sake of people who are. And I'm still triggered. I don't go to church anywhere. My wife goes to church, but if I go to a church, I find it doesn't take very long before I get out. And I don't think I could go to a Pentecostal church at all.
And I get triggered by this stuff, and I'm calling myself a Christian. I get triggered by a lot of the language and a lot of the, as I was already expressing, the theology coming out of this Pentecostal churches and other forms of extreme, like the extreme form of the Catholic Church and so on. That really triggers me. I want to stand up and jump up and say, no, there's such a different way to do this. I get really triggered by this too.
Absolutely. So, guys, can I ask you how you both got your full-time jobs as well as doing your podcast? You've got your families and so on. How are you both now? How many years is it for you since your last kick out?
I left church in 1999, was basically when I walked away. I did dabble with some sort of smaller liberal Catholicism in the early 2000s, but it was very brief. Okay. So that was really when I walked away. But when I came to a point of saying I no longer believe anymore, that was probably another 5 years after. And a lot of that was the talk about tooth decay. It looked like it was all there in the veneer, but on the inside it was rotten out. Yeah. So I would say it was probably about 2004 that I finally said I no longer believe. And it was extremely intense for me to say it out loud because of all the fear to say, I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. I believe he's dead in a ditch in Palestine somewhere. That kind of stuff was scary to say. Yes. But hey, got there.
Oh, that's fantastic. And what about you, Brian?
For me, it was probably 2012 was my last involvement in any sort of community, church community. However, I probably started to fade out somewhere around maybe 2005, 2006. I was talking the talk, but I was definitely no longer walking the walk. I used my divorce in 2011 to walk away. Yeah. So it was an easier, clean break. Yeah. Now, in saying that, I still keep in contact. I was in a very progressive church community at the time, and I am still in contact with quite a few people from that space because my relationship wasn't just based on us being part of the same church community, which I think you often find in fundamentalism. It is. You walk away, you have no commonality anymore. So I do, for both Troy and I, if you go onto our website, which is just iwasateenagerfundamentalist.com, that we talk a little bit about our journey walking away, and it mirrored so much of each other. So we did it separately. So we both left fundamentalist communities. We went to the more milder Pentup-costals. So they're still Baptist, but they definitely were more charismatic. And then away to Churches of Christ communities where it was more moderate. And then probably my last one, I would say it was incredibly progressive. We both definitely took that journey, and I think it was just an incremental step out. And I'm not an angry ex-Christian. I do see one thing that there's points throughout it where you go, I wish that hadn't happened. But I think one thing we've really tried to do in the podcast, and we make it a conscious choice to do this, of going, okay, what have we learned from that point in our life? How have we applied it? How has it made us the people we are now? And we're both quite successful in our careers, and we both often reflect and go, some of that was some of that leadership stuff that the church saw in us, and that's why we both got into leadership. But also some of those experiences have helped us shape and helped us hone our skills in particular areas, which has made us more successful in our paid careers. So there's some good stuff in it, but also just some of the skills and abilities that you pick up along the way. I think they're life skills, and there's great community. Let's not forget community. That's the biggest hook that kept us in there. And it was one of the biggest things. It's pre-made. It's a prefab community. It's easy. Sorry, Troy, you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think and I agree with you, Brian, we should do a podcast. One of the things that I think is a big difference for Brian and I, though, is the trauma. I think I suffered a lot more what is now termed religious trauma, but you can just call it trauma if you like, than I think Brian did. I think that shows in our responses, even today, when you hear me talk about Dave Andrews and the way that Brian talks about Dave Andrews. I never met Dave Andrews, but there's things in me that trigger. So I think that's one of the big differences for both of us. But I have been dealing with trauma of late and post-traumatic stress disorder, not realizing, I sensed that's what was going on, but I'd done all the talking therapy and I'd done all the dive into meditation and mindfulness and this kind of stuff, and nothing was working for me, at least nothing lasting. And then recently I stumbled over EMDR, and EMDR is a kind of therapy that they use for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it has changed my life. It really has. And one of the things that I'm into now is this post-traumatic growth, and they talk about the hero's journey. So just resonating with what Brian's saying about drawing the good out, totally. I think that's one of the ways that you can cope with all this. And looking at the hero's journey and saying that archetype of saying, I went down into the depths and I went through, and like Pinocchio is a hero's journey ultimately, and he comes home a real boy. It's that kind of thing. And seeing that in myself has actually been really powerful. And the other day I was at a concert for a band called The Offspring, and I took my son, and we were sitting in there, and I really enjoy that sort of heavy kind of music. The Offspring was one of the soundtrack CDs to my leaving fundamentalism. And sitting there with my son next to me and thinking, look at my life. I'm exactly where I want to be. Here I am sitting, listening to the music I want, next to my son, who I'm extremely proud of and have a great relationship with, and being able to look at that and say, that's the half full glass. I could have spent another 25 years in there, but I didn't. I've spent the last 25 years building my life and making my life. And I think that's what, I guess, sorry to bring it back to the podcast again, but I was a teenage fundamentalist. But it's not about sitting in that pain. It's not about bathing in the pain, but it is, I think, allowing people to come through that and give them the time that they need and the space that they need. And again, that comes back to letting them take the steps that they need and not pushing anybody to a position at the end. Anyway, written and spoken by Troy on behalf of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
I'm wondering, to both of you, what is it that you would have liked to have heard the church say to you? You're getting all these really negative messages. What would you have wanted to have heard as a Christian?
There was talk of grace, but very little action on grace. So I'm a big one for grace outside of the church experience. I think grace, forgiveness, those tenets of life can get you a long way, because it only destroys you if you're not exercising those. There's many experiences we talk about through the podcast of where there was grace absolutely preached from the pulpit, but then someone who was homosexual or battling with being a homosexual wasn't allowed in the youth group. Someone who had overdosed on drugs wasn't allowed in the youth group. Those sort of things where people were pushed out and there was absolutely no exercising of grace. I would love to have seen that, because that was, for me, that was a very big part of my pre-Christian life. I didn't come into Christianity till I was 17 and converted into a Pentecostal church. If I had have seen more of that, more acceptance, and the ability for people to actually explore, to really sit in that rather than being controlled, manipulated and coerced, then it'd be a healthy community, but it's not.
Yeah.
I think I would have liked to have heard, you're okay. I think in fairness to church, I brought shame with me. But that said, it was very much reinforced within the church. There was just this constant shaming. And I think that's a big motivator in the church as well. It's there in the theology, but it's there in the behavior. It's there in the sermons. It's constantly this, you don't measure up. And it's not just about action. It's about who you are, which is why I use the word shame. So I think I would have really liked to have heard, you're okay, you're not bad. I don't know that I ever heard that.
Gosh, both your responses are so profound, and again, take me to a heart place of sorrow that you weren't hearing that, because if grace can be just enacted, and if we just know that you are welcome whoever you are, what more do we need? This is the core of what Christianity, we're told, is supposed to be about.
The pivotal points, I think, for both Troy and I in our journeys was reading Philip Yancey, What's So Amazing About Grace.
I was just going to say that, Brian.
Yeah,
I'm telling you and I should do a podcast. We're on track.
That's also a pivotal point for me when I came out of my cult.
There you go.
Yeah.
There's some other great things that he wrote about disappointment with God, because you couldn't talk about disappointment with God. How dare you? The Jesus I never knew, those sort of things. And we had Philip Yancey on the podcast, and we were both fanboying, because we were like, you were pivotal points in our journey. You were one that made us really stop, look, listen, and go, where do we go next? But again, like, it was, Philip doesn't identify as a progressive, really, but a lot of the stuff he speaks about is being a progressive. And he's an interesting paradox, old Philip. But Dave, it was definitely a pivotal point in both our journeys, and one of the things that really helped us be able to reinforce our decision to move away from fundamentalism, I think, because it did really, it talked the talk, it walked the walk around grace, and it pointed out that biblically a church should be operating this way, and if it's not, then it's probably a dangerous place.
He gave us permission to think differently. And the cool thing about it was you could buy his book in Koorong and Word, which is where we were told the safe books are. If we had gone to the Open Book or something like that, or some sort of Uniting Church bookshop, we wouldn't have trusted it. But the fact that he's on the inside saying that, and we did a reflection episode after our interview with him, because we were just like, what do we do with this? What do we do with this guy? He's awesome. He's great. And his book's wonderful. And he's even talking about Jesus. I triggered far less with Philip Yancey than I did with Dave Andrews. And yet Philip would tell you that he's conservative theologically. Go figure.
I don't want to trump you, and I hate the word trump these days for one reason or another. But anyway, I can actually say that Philip Yancey personally showed grace to me. Because when my brother and I wrote the book about my involvement in the cult, he was one of the people we approached for endorsement. And he gave me an endorsement for the book, which was really lovely.
That is very cool.
Now, what I'm going to do now is change tack slightly, and then we'll come back to talk sex. And actually, it's a nice little segue there, because we've talked about shame. And of course, this is, in my view, one of the biggest, if not the biggest area of shame, which is sex shame. But I've got somebody I want to bring into this, and I hope you will enjoy it. You guys are a lot younger than me. Do either of you know this man?
Dave
Yes.
Allen, of course, yes.
Yes.
We're both in our 50s, Dave.
Still younger than me, buddy.
But he was part of our 70s childhood.
He was fantastic, wasn't he? You probably have seen this, but I thought this would be a nice little segue for us. So here we go.
There are certain things that, when I read the Bible, and I do read the Bible, that I find difficult to understand. If God has been there forever, what was he doing before he got to us? What was he out there doing? Was he sitting there going, bored today, what'll I do? And then suddenly from nowhere, he suddenly decided to create a world. I'll make a world, that's what. Make a world, yes, that's what I'll do. Rivers, seas, boom, mountains, boom, everything's there. I want a garden. I'd like a nice garden. Whack! Garden of Eden. Hate gardening. Need a garden. Gardener, spit and dust. Adam. Hey! And Adam, never once says, where in the name of God did I come from? He's 40 years of age. He has no child, and he has no recall. He doesn't say, how did I get here? But he's quite happy. He just crumbles around the garden, working away. And God is looking at him. And he sees that Adam is happy. I didn't put him there to be happy. I'll put a stop to that. And God, during the night, sneaks down like a thief and steals. Doesn't ask, doesn't request, steals it. His rib. And from his rib, he makes woman. And Adam wakes up in the morning, he's a real thickie. He's lying there, and there's somebody else, he doesn't say, where did you come from? How the hell did you get here? Where did you get those lumps? Just goes out and goes gardening. And God comes down and has a conversation with Eve and tells her that she can eat of any fruit in the tree in the whole garden with the exception of one fruit tree. He's talking to a woman. He actually tells her not to eat of the fruit. And then when she says, tree can't, he said, that one over there, he points it out to her. And when he goes and hides, and she sneaks up to the tree, and a snake comes down and has a conversation. A snake. Now, if I see a snake, I'll back off. One starts talking, I'll crap myself. And the snake actually convinces her to eat the apple, and she eats the apple. And when she eats the apple, she learns shame. That's what happens when you eat apples. Now, she's not ashamed that she's disobeyed God or that she's eaten the apple. She's ashamed of one part of her body. That's all. She becomes ashamed of that area of the body. Now, why that area? Why not her elbow? Her nose. Do you actually realize that if Eve had been ashamed of her nose, Every woman in the world now would be ashamed of your noses. You'd all be sitting here tonight with little nose knickers on. Men would be in nightclubs watching totally naked ladies with G-strings on the nose. Take them off. Oh, I saw a nose.
If you have any reflections on that from your Christian background, when you go back to the early stages of the church, we often talk about Augustine and his about sex, and he believed that if Adam and Eve had sex in the garden, it would be fully controlled, because the issue that he had was with the parts of the body that seemed to have a life of their own and couldn't be controlled. So it would have been perfectly intentional. There would have been no lust, no desire. They would just say, we're going to have sex at this point. We'll do this. It'll take us 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, whatever. Then it'll be over and we'll get back to gardening. And then the teachings that continue from there, that have continued to even the present day, and the purity movement. The first interview that we had, which is the most successful so far, this will be much more successful, was with Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers, who is a sexologist, Christian sexologist in America. And she went into that work because of all the couples who kept coming to her traumatized by the teachings that they had from the church, and the fact that they couldn't partner, they couldn't date, they couldn't kiss, they couldn't do anything to the marriage night when everything was supposed to be wonderful. Brian or Troy, do you have anything, comments on that?
David, speaking of trauma, I was pondering this appearance and this conversation that we were going to have, because I think one of the things that the podcast has really brought up for me was how damaging my experience was of my sexuality, my experience in church. So like you, I was involved in a cult. We also would label our Assemblies of God experience as cultish now as well. But I was involved in a group called the Revival Centre. And the Revival Centre's international at the time, very uptight about sex. They would force marriages, kids that touched each other, and they were kids under 18, that would touch each other, not even have penetrative sex. They would be forced to marry. And I knew that the way that they kicked people out was wrong, was bad, but I was also indoctrinated enough to be afraid to leave the organization. So I was 17 years old. So what I did was I thought, okay, I'm going to go and have sex because I know that's a kick-outable offense, and then I'm going to dob myself in. And that way, when Jesus returns, I haven't left the true church. They kicked me out and Jesus would know that's wrong. I was 17. So when I went to them, though, of course, they're a cult, right? They're not going to make it easy. And I wasn't expecting this, but they actually said to me, the pastor said to me, you've probably lost your salvation. Now, the revival centers later came out with formal doctrine that, yes, if you have sex outside of marriage, then you have lost your salvation. So at 17 years old, I was, and this is where my PTSD began, I was extremely damaged by that and by that experience. And so I have carried this warped view of sex and this damaged sexuality for the last 35 years. And we interviewed Tom Tilley, who wrote a book called Speaking in Tongues, and we were in the same cult. He was involved in the Revival Centre. And I read his book. And then when I interviewed him, I said, Tom, do you think this has messed you up sexually? Because a big theme in his book was sex. And he's, I don't think so. And I'm thinking, oh, dude, it totally has. Like, I'm reading your book. But it actually made me think, yeah, I knew I was damaged, but I didn't realize how damaged I was. And then going into the Assemblies of God and into the Baptist Union, places like that, I think I was more ready for the shame around sex. So I know that's a heavy one to throw out there first, but that was my starting journey really with Christianity, was at 17 years old being told that God no longer loves you because you've had a one-night stand with a girl. And the whole plan was to actually somehow keep God's appeasement. And yet it all just backfired and blew up in my face. Yeah, man, that was tough.
No, thank you for sharing that. That's horrendous. Then I leap across that there to some of the gay folk that we are trying to support, and the hatred that they have on top of what you and I might have experienced. It's just horrible. Brian, did you want to comment there?
Yeah, we were talking about this recently, actually. I think it was a question response that we had where someone asked us about sex, and I think we responded around that. I can't remember, but it was interesting. My unhealthy view of sex, I think, started before the church and then was magnified in the church. And those in Australia may remember in the early 80s, maybe mid-80s, we had the Grim Reaper bowling campaign for AIDS. So if you have sex, you're going to get AIDS, and then the Grim Reaper will bowl you over and you'll die. So I think that was really drummed into you as a tween. I was probably 12 or something like that when that was coming into the fore, and I was just like, oh my God, sex, and this is what happens if you have sex. You'll probably catch AIDS and you'll probably die. And then coming into the church in my late teens, you're then hit in the face with purity culture, going, you've got to do X, Y, and Z, and this is how you have a relationship. This is when you have sex. This is how you have sex, because God forbid you do anything but the missionary position. And I remember conversations with people about oral sex, going, is oral sex okay in God's eyes? Oh, no, not oral sex, only penetrative sex. Vagina, penis, that's it. And so there was all these super conservative views around it. But eventually you found yourself parroting that, and the guilt and the shame when you had a girlfriend or a partner in the church. Most people straight, it was very difficult to stay within the boundaries set for you. And when you did, you're just constantly praying for forgiveness with each other. And we won't do it again until you do it again about 3 minutes later. So it was that sort of thing, which I think was an incredibly difficult message to sell, because again, here we were, no grace. But there was also no honest talking about it with leaders. And all the leaders would say is, you don't do this, you don't do this, you don't do this, and this is what you do. There's no sex education per se, particularly for those kids that have grown up in the church and have absolutely no idea about their bodies, made to feel ashamed of them. And that's certainly what we got drawn into. And it's certainly the message. And I think it probably even when I married at 23, and definitely you carry that into marriage. It's just like, how do we work with this sex thing even within the marriage? And we were trying to instill all these rules in our marriage and going, now, if you ever have thoughts that stray about another person, you've got to confess it to the other person straight away. And this accountability and control of each other. And we tried to institute that. And I remember a couple of times we did it. It was like, oh, okay, that was difficult, because you're human and you think about other people. It's absolutely what you do. And it was seen as wrong and it was seen as difficult. But if you were there together and you were there in the Lord, everything would be fine.
Did either of you ever have thoughts about me? Because that'd be nice to think that you did.
I didn't, Troy. It makes my wife, I'll text her and find out.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah,
because,
that'd be good to know.
Troy and I have known each other since we were about 20-ish, so about 30 years. So a bit over 30 years. It is possible, Troy, because we mixed in the same circle.
Yeah, I was quite pretty back then, so I wouldn't be surprised.
You still are.
Thanks.
So yeah, in a nutshell, absolutely, the messaging, the navigation of it, all incredibly unhealthy and unforgiving.
I was just thinking there, some time ago, I've been writing stuff about this sort of thing for years, as Cath knows, and with a view to writing a book, and now we're doing a podcast instead. But there was an article, there was a chapter of a book that I wrote, because I work with people with disabilities. I imagine somebody on the autism spectrum raised by a Catholic grandmother in Ireland, who instilled in him the importance of confession and the importance of noting your sin. And I describe him walking down the street and carrying a notebook, and every now and then he stops and he writes down something because he's had a nasty thought about someone. He passes a shop window and there's mannequins, male mannequins, and he thinks, oh, that looks really nice. And he's, oh, am I having homosexual thoughts? So he writes that down. And really, that actually is quite real, because if you've worked with people who have autism, this is how they live. And if you instill them in them, and so some of us might even be on the spectrum anyway, the things that you're told to avoid, I can't do this, you can't do that, that's so traumatizing. Cath, you've actually helped a lot of people with the spiritual direction. Did you?
Yes. I'm actually thinking also of the wonderful work that Nadia Boltz-Weber is doing in her work. Yeah. She's written a book. She's a Lutheran pastor in the United States, and she's written a book called Shameless, where she's exploring sexuality within a Christian context and saying the shame that you two are talking about, that we've all experienced with the church context, is wrong. It's wrong. There's no grace in that, as we were talking about earlier. It's so good that there are voices coming up saying, you are loved, you're just you, and our sexuality is a beautiful, wonderful thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of confusion. We've had guests, had a couple of very powerful episodes on the podcast about homosexuality and people's time in the church, with some high profile, some not. So Anthony Van Brown, we did a 3-episode around, people listen to that, and this is someone who's high profile in ministry and was struggling with their sexuality, but also it was probably around episode 60 something, maybe 62, can't remember, gay, great big G. And it was a friend of ours, Andrew, from back then. And the absolute trauma and the torture, the internal torture that you hear through both of those recounts is just shameful. It is absolutely shameful that the church would do that, particularly around homosexuality, where there's all these made-up rules around it. It's absolutely bullshit. But the church uses those, and they use these things to absolutely coerce, to manipulate, to try and program people. And it doesn't work. I know people now who've been through gay conversion therapy. They still go to church and they are practicing a gay lifestyle, and they're just doing it in the shadows. And that's what this does, this practice does. It pushes people into the shadows, and it pushes people into a place where they feel so incredibly ashamed to the depth of their core of who they are, because they can't be genuine. They can't be legitimately who they need to be, Troy.
Coming back to what David said early on about this sort of ancient thinking about Augustine, etc., that's the thing about all this, right? This talk, it's not that the church has lost its way and started to preach this shamefulness with the rise of fundamentalism in the 1700s or something. This is an ancient belief and ancient practices. And that's one of my objections to Christianity. The idea that if, and I realize this is coming from a fundamentalist framework, and that's who I'm speaking to, so I'm not trying to offend Cath, but looking at Christianity and saying, if this is really God's plan, if this is really, if we're all filled with the Holy Spirit, and as you gather together, Jesus is there in the midst of you and all that kind of talk, then why is this just so fucked up? Why is it just so messed up? And so that's, for me, when I look at this, that's one of the big reasons why I think this is rotten at the root. Hence, I'm not a Christian.
Yeah. And you can't have a foot in each camp. You can't have a foot saying you're originally damned and one foot saying you're originally blessed. You just can't do that. And so you've got this great split within Christianity. You're either originally blessed, which is the whole Eastern Orthodox and several of us living in the West, and the other side saying you're originally damned. And you just can't have a foot in each. So if you're going to be in the Western way, mostly the Western way, which is originally damned, we're talking here about the fallout of such an understanding.
I think we may end up needing to do this again sometime if you guys are willing to do that, because this whole area of sex, as my eldest son reminded me that I'm approaching 70, but I keep telling him I've got well over a year to go for that, so just give me a break. But since we've started doing this, I've started to realize how much sex shame I still have. So for example, I use the thing that, by asking people how you learned about sex, right? And recently interviewed a fellow who we've been working with for some time, and he's in Seattle. He's from Uganda, bisexual man. And anyway, I asked him the question, how do boys and girls learn about sex in Uganda? And he said the girls are taught by their aunts, right? It's a common thing. An aunt comes in and talks about sex to the girls when they have their first period. And I asked the obvious question, why don't the mothers do that? And the answer, of course, was they're too ashamed. Right? So then who teaches the boys? And the answer is no one. The boys learn it from other boys or older boys. So it's not talked about in their churches or their mosques or in their schools. And I have a saying these days with it, which is, if it's not discussed, it's disgusting. You have this silent thing. Troy or Brian, would you be willing to tell us how you learned about sex? I learned it from a book my father had in the drawer, and from my doctor's, my best mate at the time. His father was a doctor, so I could go to him with technical questions because Dad told him, if you're not comfortable to go there, that's okay. But if you are...
Nothing's off limits, David. I've got 7 older siblings.
Oh, wow. So, okay. That helped.
Right there. But also from peers. There wasn't any formal education. I mean, at school, It was really surface stuff,
Okay.
but it was definitely, for me, it was peer groups and also older siblings, definitely.
And Troy.
Yeah, I think for me it was largely friends,
Okay.
local neighborhood kids,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. I think that's where I first heard about it. And then there's the introduction of porn. We did have formal sex ed, both in late primary school and early secondary. So I think there was some corrections put in there in terms of some of the ideas. But I think media had a big part to play in the warping and the strangeness around sex. I don't think it's all been the church's fault.
Yeah, no, I think my belief is that you go back far enough, and because the church had so much power and religion had so much power, that the message was conveyed, but then it becomes culture. And there are some places, of course, that resisted that really strongly. But I've just published a podcast an interview I did a couple of months ago with a Lutheran deacon from America, Ross Murray. And he's an openly gay man. He's married to his husband, and he's an extraordinary fellow, really. But I asked him that question, and he told me that his parents sat him down to watch a movie called 13 Candles, I think it was. I'd never seen the movie. He had no idea why they used that. It was, I think it's about a teenage love affair or something, but very bland. And he said at the end of it that, mum and dad started to give him this heavy sex talk. And when they finished going through all the technical stuff, mum said, "Do you have any questions?" And he said, "Yes." And he said he was 13. He said, "When the man takes his penis out of the woman's vagina, does it go pop?" which is hilarious.
I hope the answer was sometimes.
I'm going to draw it to a close only because of time. I'm really grateful to both of you, Troy and Brian, and to Cath for joining us today. I think this has been really valuable. If you don't mind, I'm just going to share one more thing on the screen. I did this some time ago, and I'll be sharing this. Your interview comes up first, and then I'll be doing this one. And I did it with our panel, which included Cath. This is a tragic story. It was a guy who was studying at university back in probably the early 70s. I know his first name. I could find his surname, but I won't do that. And I won't give his name. He was taken by students at the Catholic College at Sydney University into a basement. They were stripped, they were beaten senseless, and they were sexually abused. Then they were put in the boot of a car, and they were taken to up a dirt road and dumped in a ditch in the Royal National Park. And he managed to stagger back. The other guy was traumatized too much to even move. And he started to walk back along this dirt road until he found a ranger's cottage and rang for the police. Cut a long story short, this is a Catholic, a mitre that he took 2 years and cape and everything for the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney. And it has emblems on it that describes the torture that they went through. The worst part of it was that he was summoned when it came during that week to the principal's office and the Archbishop of Sydney. It's timely to say this because we just had a cardinal die, certain cardinal. And it was the Archbishop of Sydney, a different man, obviously, sitting next to the principal of the school. And he said to him, "You're not serious, son, about taking this to court. You're going to badly affect the futures of leading politicians, lawyers, judges in this country." And he said he certainly was going to do that. He walked out of the office and went straight to the telephone, rang the police, and the person that he spoke to said, "I'm really sorry, son. We've had to destroy the file. You don't know how powerful these people are." And he's carried that trauma ever since. And he doesn't put himself out there because his counsellor says it wouldn't do his mental health any good. He does name 2 of the students at the school. He doesn't name the people who did the crime because he feels that the biggest injustice was the injustice from the institution. But 2 of the people who were studying at the same time, one was a certain person by the name of Tony Abbott, and the other was Hockey. And when these 2 guys would walk into the dining hall, they would be jeered by the students. Even telling you that makes me feel very angry, but also very moved. So that's coming up. But look, you guys with your podcast, and I think what we're doing is important. At the end of the day, I don't want to destroy the church, or churches, but I want to see that churches are much more inclusive. And if they're going to preach a message of love, that it is love. And if they're going to talk about grace, there is grace.
David, can I just throw something in there, just
Please,
in what you were saying about not wanting to destroy the church? I think what's important is for people like us that have stepped out, we have nothing to lose.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the big reasons why a lot of progressive Christians like us, because we can say the things that they maybe don't feel that they can, and it's still true.
Yep.
And so I agree with you. And one of the things that we have tried to do, or we're planning to do this year, and we've tried to do up to this point, is to connect with people like yourselves and with other people that are in the space. There is so much room for all of us to go about this in different ways with very similar goals. So I want to commend you for creating a space for this kind of conversation. This is probably a lot deeper and a lot heavier than we would go on our podcast, but still super important and super valuable. So thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much to each of you.
Please don't forget to support the podcast through Patreon, other sources, or direct to our website. This podcast supports refugees who are suffering terribly in Africa because of religious hate. It's time to show them some love.